People always talk about deficits as being bad because we need to borrow to make up the shortfall. We've already looked at why bond sales aren't a borrowing operation and that in fact the government can't really borrow its own currency, but I want to talk about why specifically deficit spending is good. In order to examine why deficit spending is good, we're going to go back to the RBA. The RBA is the Reserve Bank of Australia, and private banks in Australia such as the Commonwealth, the NAB, Westpac, all have accounts at the RBA. And in the accounts at the RBA, there are things called reserves. And reserves are denominated in Australian dollars. All reserves are denominated in Australian dollars. Now, at the RBA, we also have foreign bank accounts like the Bank of China. And they also hold Australian dollar reserves. That happens because they export goods to us. In exchange for their goods, we give them some Australian dollar credits at the RBA. So what impact do these reserves have on the Australian economy? Well, if I have an account at the CBA and I have $1,000 in it and I withdraw my $1,000, the CBA converts that to notes and coins. And so they actually have to have enough reserves to cover my cash withdrawal. So reserves are transferable to notes and coins. But we all know that most of the money we spend in our economy nowadays is electronic. And the CBA can actually also create what are called deposits. So say the CBA lends me $1,000. Now the CBA has lent me $1,000 and it has $1,000 in reserves. If I choose to withdraw this $1,000 as notes and coins, the CBA will need to have $1,000 in reserves to cover it. But what happens instead if I buy something electronically from someone with an account at the NAB? Well, they don't need to transfer the dollars right that second. Now let's say that someone else at the NAB has a $1,000 deposit created by a loan. If that person buys something from someone electronically at the CBA, those two transactions cancel each other out. And the banks at the end of the day don't actually need to cover any of that deposit money with reserves. So banks create a lot of deposits through loans and rely on the fact that funds flow between the banks evenly enough that they don't need to have all the reserves ready to cover those transactions and settle up with each other at the end of the day. Because the banks can't settle up with each other using deposits they've created through loans. They have to settle up with each other using reserves. Now let's say that I work for the government and the government pays me some money. Now, I get another credit to my bank account, but instead of just getting the credit created by the loan from the bank's account at the RBA gets credited with $1,000, and then my deposit with the bank also gets credited with $1,000. Now the same thing applies. If I buy something out electronically, the banks still have to settle up at the end of the day. And the person receiving the money can't tell the difference between money that was created through government spending or money that was created through a loan from the bank. The difference is that the $1,000 that was created through a loan has interest paid on it. So even though once the transaction's complete, the person receiving the money can't tell the difference, the person who spent the money still has to keep paying interest to the bank for the $1,000 loan. So the less money that is created through government spending, the more money that gets created through private sector credit creation. And that means that more and more money has interest being paid on it. So every $1,000 that someone spends that was created through a loan attracts interest over the lifetime of the loan, whereas money spent as a result of government money creation does not attract interest on behalf of the person that was paid. So if we let the banks create too much of our money, then what happens is eventually too much of our GDP is spent on interest payments. And people can't do other things then, like go out to coffee shops and spend money on clothing and pay someone to come around and watch their children while they go out and see a movie and do all these other things in the economy that keep things moving around and give everyone income, because people spending equals income. So if the government doesn't spend enough money, then it's left up to the private sector to create enough money in order to accommodate economic growth and the private sector goes further and further into debt. That's what people mean when they say the private sector is going into debt. It means that people are spending more than their income, and a greater amount of the money in circulation is attracting interest payments. So why does the government need to deficit spend then? Can't it just spend the same amount that it taxes? Well, people don't just want to spend everything they receive. They also want to save some money. And also, the economy is constantly growing. In a country like Australia, where we import more than we export, people like the Bank of China are accumulating our dollars because every time they export to us, we give them another credit at our bank account. If we all of a sudden started exporting to China, then the money that China had built up would flow back into our system, and it might cause inflation, so the government would have to tax to remove more of the spending power from the people who are receiving that money from the Bank of China. But until that happens, the government needs to create more money than it destroys through taxation in order to accommodate for economic growth and the propensity of people to save some of their money. Otherwise, we're leaving it up to private banks to create all of the money to accommodate growth, which means that the private sector goes more into debt and a greater percentage of GDP is spent on interest payments rather than productive economic activity.